Okay, thank you so much. Good day, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. Special thanks to Julie for inviting me and Danny Rothstein from Jewish Mallorca who introduced me to Julie. When I told my friends 15 years ago that I'm going to work in Suriname, the most common response was, Suri who? One of my friends said to me, Jacob, I'm afraid they are sending you to a place that doesn't exist. So let me start with some basic information about Suriname. Suriname is one of the smallest and least populated nations in South America. It is bounded by French-speaking French Guyana in the east, English-speaking Guyana in the west, and Portuguese-speaking Brazil in the south. The population is about 615,000 people. The capital city is Paramaribo. Suriname is the most ethnically diverse country in South America and the Caribbean. The main ethnic groups are Hindustanis. They are originally from northern India. They came in the late part of the 19th century to work in the plantations after slavery was abolished. The Maroons are descendants of escaped African slaves. Creoles are mixed of European and European ancestry. Javanese are people from the island of Java in Indonesia. They also came to work in the plantations after the slavery was abolished. And then we have mixed race, American Indians, Chinese, whites, etc. The main religious groups are Protestant, Hindu, Catholic, and Muslim. The Muslim population is mainly from the people from Java, and some of them are from India. The official language is Dutch, but the spoken language is called Sranan Tongo. This is a mixture of African languages, Portuguese, Dutch, English, Yiddish, and Hebrew. I'll give you a couple of examples. Bad food is treif. Problems are tsuras. And I have many, many words in Hebrew and Yiddish that part of the mixture. Paramaribo, the capital, is also known as the Wooden City. It was placed in the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2002, and there are a few hundred magnificent wooden colonial buildings in the city center. One of them is the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral. It was built in 1809 as the Jewish theater. It was bought by the Catholic Church and reconstructed as a cathedral in 1885. The cathedral is the biggest wooden structure in the Western Hemisphere, and it is absolutely spectacular. Another magnificent building is our synagogue, Neve Shalom. We will see the interior of the synagogue a little bit later. Now, Suriname is a country that 90% of it covered by dense rainforest jungles and rivers. There are no roads to the interior. You rather take a small airplane, like in the right picture, or a dugout canoes through the river system to go to the interior. The country also has a diverse wildlife with many rare species living in the wild. So in 2009, when I was in Australia, I read an article about Suriname in the Australian newspaper. They called the country the Last Eden. So now that we know that Suriname does exist, our presentation will have four parts. The first one is the history of the Suriname Jewish community. The second one is Suriname during World War II. The third part is Suriname after World War II. And the last one is Suriname Jewish community today. So, oops. The history of the Jewish community in Suriname, part one. 530 years ago, in 1492, following the Alhambra decree, the Spanish Inquisition ordered the expulsion of Jews who will not convert. So about 100,000 Spanish Jews were expelled to Portugal, Italy, Greece, the Balkans, Turkey, and North Africa. About 200,000 Jews who stayed in Spain had to convert, and they are known as conversos, or moranos, or anusim in Hebrew. 4 years later, Portugal introduced its own version of the Inquisition, but expulsion wasn't an option for the Portuguese Jews. It was convert or die. 90 years later, in 1581, the 4 northern provinces of Holland declared independence from Spanish rule. One of the first things they did was they declared freedom of religion. It was at that time a revolutionary concept. As a result, in 1600, thousands of Portuguese and Spanish Jews moved to Amsterdam and established the Dutch Jewish community. They enjoyed freedom of religion, but they were not allowed to own land. And Europe at that time was agrarian society. So no land meant exclusion from wealth. But new opportunities in the New World attracted thousands of Portuguese Jews to the Dutch colonies where they allowed to own land. In 1593, Suriname was discovered by the Spanish, but never settled. In 1639, the first group of Portuguese and Spanish Jews arrived via Dutch Brazil, which is now Recife. They settled in a place called Torarica. They cleared the jungle and started sugar plantations. Later on, Torarica became the first capital of Suriname. And it's so interesting because in Spanish and Portuguese, Torarica means Torah Rica, our rich or splendid Torah. So this is the first and last capital city in the world that was called after our rich Torah. Now, 12 years later, in 1651, after 2 failed attempts by the British to colonize Suriname, Sir Francis Willoughby founded a permanent British colony. The British settlers came mainly from Barbados, and they lived together with the Jews in Torarica. A year later, a second group of Portuguese Jews came, and they settled in a place nearby called Cassipora Creek. The third group came in 1665. They led by a gentleman called David Nassi, and they arrived via Cayenne, which is now French Guiana. They came from Holland and joined the group in Cassipora Creek, and in 1667, they built a wooden synagogue there. Now, even though the Jews were not allowed to live in England at that time, it was British policy to encourage as many settlers as possible in the colonies. So in 1665, an Anglo-Dutch war started in European waters. 5 months after the outbreak of the war, the British granted special privileges to the Jews. Why? So they will not leave. The Jews were the backbone of the economy. They have the knowledge on how to run successful plantations, and they had an excellent relationship with the American Indians. The special privileges included freedom of religion, freedom to have Jewish schools, freedom to own land, freedom to have their own court of justice, which meant the Jews now have self-rule, and the right to have their own private civil guard or army. So these rights made the Jews of Suriname the only diaspora community to achieve complete political autonomy before the founding of the State of Israel. In 1667, a peace agreement known as the Second Breda Treaty was signed. In Article 3 of the agreement, there was kind of a swap of land. Suriname was given to the Dutch and New Amsterdam to the British. New Amsterdam is now known as New York City. So in retrospect, it seems like the worst real estate transaction ever. But for the Dutch, it was the deal of the century. Why? Because the importance of sugar. Sugar was the most valuable commodity at that time, better than gold. There were 100 ships sailing between Suriname and Holland carrying sugarcane that was processed by thousands of small factories in Holland, employed tens of thousands of people, and the Dutch traders sold the sugar all over Europe. So everybody that was involved in the supply chain of sugar became rich. So after 15 years of British colony rule, the colony changed hands. In 1667, the Dutch feared that the Jews will live with the British, so they kept special privileges. In addition, 2 years later, in 1669, the Dutch granted the right to establish a Jewish colony, known in Dutch, it's Joden Savannah, or the Jewish Savannah. With these all privileges, the Jews felt that here, as you can see in the picture, in the middle of the jungle, they found their true promised land. They called the place Jerusalem on the riverside. And here in the middle of the Amazon jungle, they started building their own Jerusalem. If you come to the Joden Savannah, you'll see this sign said, "Welcome to the Joden Savannah." the former residence of the Portuguese Jewish nation in Suriname. The Jews thrived in the Jewish savannah. If in Tararica they had to live with the British, here it was the only place in the world where the Jews lived and governed their own town. In 1685, they built a brick synagogue called Bracha v'Shalom, or Blessing and Peace. The town became the center of Jewish life. They had the synagogue there, the court of justice, the school, and the communal authorities. The number started to grow very fast. If in 1694 they had about 575 Jews who owned 40 plantations, 43 years later, there were about 1,500 to 2,000 Jews. 800 of them owned 115 plantations out of the 400 in the colony. Now, you have to understand that according to the special privileges, the plantation's owner could be only Sephardic Jews. Since they all were religious Orthodox Jews, they gave the plantations biblical names, such as Carmel, Beit El, Hebron, Beersheba, Machanaim, Sukkot, Gilgal, Goshen. If you look at the list, you think you are in Israel somewhere. On Shabbat and the holidays, the Jews from the plantations used to come to celebrate in the Jordan Savannah and socialize. The historian Robert Cohen, in his book Jews in Another Environment, said that the most important Jewish center in the Western Hemisphere during the 18th century was the great colony, Suriname. There, Jews formed perhaps the most privileged Jewish community in the world. Now, not like the Dutch settlers who came to make money and go back to Holland, the Jews came to stay. For 100 years, the Jewish savannah was a flourishing community. The success attracted hundreds of Ashkenazi Jews to Suriname, but they were not allowed to own land. So they became petty traders and merchants in the new capital, Paramaribo. But nothing is forever. Between 1765 and 1795, social, political, and financial changes caused the collapse of Suriname's sugar plantation-based economy. It was the perfect storm. From 115 plantations in 1734, 50 years later, there were only 46 Jewish plantations left, mainly lumber and coffee, no more sugar. From being very rich, in no time, 2/3 of the community was pulled down to poverty. The Jews moved to the new capital, Paramaribo. Jewish Savannah continued to be the rabbinical and spiritual Jewish center. There were about 22 families or 100 people stayed there, but they were mostly elderly people and impoverished. The Jews returned to the Jordan Savannah to celebrate the high holidays until September 1832, when a big fire reduced the building to ashes. And within few years, the jungle took over and overgrew the remains of the Jordan Savannah. Since most of the Jews moved to the new capital Paramaribo, in 1825, all the special privileges to the Jews were terminated by the Dutch crown. The Jews lost everything. Now they worked in trade and professionals in Paramaribo, but the Jewish population started to decline and decline fast. If in the peak in 1737, there were about 2,000 Jews living in Suriname, in 1937, there were only 789 Jews left. And when Suriname gained its independence in 1975, their number were down to 500 people and continued to decline. Many of the Jews that arrived in the 17th century settled in the new capital Paramaribo. The Ashkenazi Jews spoke Dutch and Yiddish among themselves, while the Sephardic Jews spoke Portuguese until 1837. Now, between 1690 and 1760, the two communities prayed together in the Neve Shalom synagogue. But in 1716, the Sephardic Jews, who saw themselves superior to the Ashkenazi Jews, as they enjoy all the special privileges and they were the wealthy ones, they decided to split and build their own synagogue. In 1734, the division between the two communities were formalized, and the Sephardic built their own synagogue, Tzedek v'Shalom, or Justice and Peace. What is interesting is that after the split, the Ashkenazi community continued to worship according to the Sephardic rite. which is surviving until today. Only after the collapse of the sugar plantation in 1789, the two communities started to work together again. We'll move to the second part of the presentation, and we talk about Suriname during World War II. Tiny Suriname was the world's major supplier of bauxite. Bauxite is the primary ore for aluminum. After the outbreak of World War II in September 1st, 1939, the United States could not afford losing a major supplier of bauxite, because without aluminum, aircraft and shipbuilding production would have been stopped. The first alarming sign of things to come happened on May 10, 1940. It was the same day the neutral Holland fell to German forces. A German cargo ship named the Goslar was sank by its captain in the middle of the Suriname River in an attempt to block the flow of bauxite out of Suriname. This is the picture at the top of the Goslar few minutes before the captain sank it. The middle picture is minutes after he sank the boat. And the bottom one is how it looks like today. Still, the remains are on the middle of the Suriname River in Paramaribo. The neighbor of Suriname in the east, French Guiana, was now controlled by pro-German Vichy government. They could cross the Maravane River, which is the border between the two countries, and within 1 hour, they could have occupied and destroyed the unprotected mines in eastern Suriname. In addition, thousands of German immigrants sympathetic to the Nazis were in Brazil and in other neighboring countries. So the threat was real. As a result, on September 1st, 1941, President Roosevelt offered Queen Wilhelmina, she was the exiled Queen of Holland, to station 3,000 infantry and anti-aircraft troops to defend Suriname. That was 3 months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But the lack of basic infrastructure in Suriname required the Americans to invest heavily in building, among others, a military aircraft, roads, and military barracks. So tiny Suriname, with less than 200,000 people, enjoyed an economic boom that lasted the whole war period. The famous Surinamese historian and writer Cynthia McLeod told me a few years ago that if you asked any Surinamese, what do you think about World War II? The answer would have been, those were our best days ever. Now, after the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany, the Anschluss in March 1939, President Roosevelt initiated the Evian Conference in France in July 1932. That was to discuss the refugee problem created by Jews fleeing persecution in Germany and Austria. The conference was attended by 32 countries. The conference was ultimately failed. The 32 nations failed to come to any agreement about accepting Jewish refugees from the Third Reich. Only one country agreed to accept 100,000 refugees. It was the Dominican Republic, a small and impoverished country, population of 1.6 million people. Unfortunately, President Roosevelt undermined the plan as he feared that the Dominican Republic is too close to the USA and many of the refugees will end up in America. Only about 1,000 German Jewish refugees managed to arrive to Dominican Republic before the gates were closed. There are a few other Caribbean colonies at that time that allowed between 600 to 2,000 refugees to come to their places. Among them were Trinidad, Jamaica, and Suriname. Hundreds of Jewish refugees settled in Suriname in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Among them, I will give only two examples. The first group of refugees arrived in 1938. There were the entire Sephardic Jewish community of Hamburg, Germany. And the last group was refugees who arrived on Christmas Eve in 1942. It was 123 refugees, including 75 Dutch Jews. They arrived on the board of a ship called the Naesa. It was a Portuguese ship that left Lisbon, Portugal. Now, the local Surinamese parliament and the local population did their best to help the refugees. They provided the refugees with small homes built specially for them, and they could get jobs in the booming Surinamese economy immediately. The refugees, as you can see in this picture, as they arrived, they first stayed in this house, and they were taking care of everything: food, clothing, and once they got their process through the system, they started getting their own homes and working in the country. But I have to tell you one thing. We have to understand the local population was very supportive of the Jewish refugees, but the Dutch governor generals were not so sympathetic. They did their best to undermine the efforts. After the war, there was an attempt to resettle 30,000 Jewish refugees in Saramacca. After the war, there were between 7 to 11 million displaced persons, or DPs, in camps scattered in Germany, Austria, and Italy. Among them, there are 250,000 Jews, Holocaust survivors. With the British restriction on the immigration to then Palestine and the slow acceptance of Jewish refugees in Western countries, for example, only in 1948, 3 years after the end of the war, US authorized 80,000 Jews from DP camps to be accepted as immigrants. In Canada, in 1945, discussing how many Jewish refugees should be allowed to enter Canada after the war, an anonymous Canadian government bureaucrat offered the now infamous reply, "None is too many." So while the Jewish refugees were sitting for years after the end of the war in DP camps, the Freeland League, an anti-Zionist organization, came up with a plan known as the Saramacca Plan, settling 30,000 Jewish refugees in the district of Saramacca. Now, most people never heard about Saramacca. Saramacca is a district in Suriname. In 1946, there were only a couple of thousand people living in Saramacca. The district was isolated. There were no roads in the jungle, and there was no bridge over the Saramacca River that could connect it with the capital Paramaribo, which is only 50 kilometers away. Even today, there are only about 18,000 people living in Saramacca. At that time, it was mainly jungle, with many exotic but dangerous wildlife, such as poisonous frogs, snakes, and jaguars. In 1946, the League met with high-ranking Dutch officials to discuss the idea of resettling the 30,000 Jewish refugees in Saramacca. In February 1947, the League was informed that the local Surinamese parliament had no objection of the proposed Jewish settlement. Remember, the Jews were the founding of this country, and they're very well respected by the locals. So in April 1947, a delegation was sent to Saramacca to study the land and to develop plans for the settlement. The League also secured $35 million from American donors. It is equivalent for about $500 million in today's money, US dollars. That was to fund the plan, and it meant there would be no cost to the host country, Suriname. Soon after, the Surinamese government signed an agreement providing the 30,000 Jewish settlers the right of autonomy, where Yiddish would be the language of education. That was the Freeland League's vision, an Eastern European-like Jewish life in the jungles of the Amazon basin. As the news broke, Jews in a DP camp in Vienna, Austria, announced their eagerness to move to Saramacca. The League worked tirelessly on starting to implement the plan, but on May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was established. After severe pressure from the Dutch government, the colonial power, the Surinamese parliament caved into the pressure and informed the Freeland League that all negotiations were suspended. The Jews have their own land now, and they can go to Israel. A few years ago, I was speaking with Shul Dong. He's the president of the Jewish community in Suriname, and he lives on a farm in Saramacca. And Shul said to me, "Jacob, think about it. If the Saramacca plan was implemented, and even 90% of the Jews, or the refugees that came, would have moved to different countries. We still would have been today a community with thousands of members. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So let me go to the last part of the presentation and talk about the Suriname Jewish community today. As their numbers continue to decline, in 1999, the two congregations, the Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities, merged. The community changed from Orthodox to liberal, so everyone will feel welcome. The two communities decided to use the Neve Shalom synagogue as their active synagogue. That's how it looks like inside. As you can see, the synagogue has sandy floor. It is one of the last 4 Portuguese synagogues in the world with sandy floor. The other 3 are in Jamaica, Curacao, and St. Thomas. The old Sephardic synagogue, Tzedek V'Shalom, was closed down and its contents were moved in 2010 to the replica that was built in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Now, what are the challenges of the community today? The first and the most important is demographics. It's a small size community, less than 100 members today. They're aging. We lost 13 members in the last 2 years. Second problem is immigration. If in the past there was a flow of Jews from Holland to Suriname and from Suriname to Holland, today the flow is a one-way out of Suriname. We lost 24 young members in the last few years. Some of them went to study overseas and didn't come back. Others got job opportunities in other countries. Some made aliyah to Israel. As a result, there are very few opportunities for the young people to meet Jewish partners. And that leads to, unfortunately, to assimilation. The second big challenge is religious leadership. The community is without a rabbi for more than 60 years. They just cannot afford a full-time rabbi in the community. And the third challenge is finance. The community has 2 synagogues, 3 cemeteries, and many other assets to maintain. They are very old buildings, very expensive to maintain. The country also is very poor. Over 70% of the population lives below the poverty line. Average salary is about $350 to $400 a month. The country is in economic crisis. The annual inflation is over 50% per year, and as a result, there are restrictions on the use of foreign exchange. If in Canada or the US, if you need to buy challah, candles for Shabbat, kosher wine, anything Jewish, I can go to any supermarket in my neighborhood and buy it. In Suriname, everything Jewish has to be imported. It is very expensive. And what do you do if you can't buy foreign exchange to pay for it? For example, the matzot and kosher wine for the Passover Seder has to be imported from Miami. So how do you pay for them? So those are the solutions the community came with to these challenges. On the demographic side, there are about 20 people that are currently attending conversion classes. It is run by Rabbi Menno Brink from Amsterdam. Until COVID-19 arrived, he used to come every month for 10 days for intensive classes, but it was disrupted, and now we do it through Zoom, the classes. Now you may ask yourself, who are those guys who want to become Jews in Suriname? So, some of them are married to Jewish partners. Others, their ancestors were Jews. They say in Suriname that if you shake your family tree, few Jews will fall. So those are some of the fallen Jews from local family trees. And others they just want to be Jews. They come to services for years, they're participating in all the events, and now they have the opportunity to make it happen. So we are very excited as we hope that they will bring new energy to the community. On the religious leadership, there's no way that we can afford a rabbi. But for the high holidays, we have 2 good friends from New York and 1 Surinamese guy who lives in Aruba. They are Torah readers. And they joined the 2 Torah readers of the community to help. And the high holidays are just magnificent. These guys are fantastic. On the financial side, in my opinion, I'm a finance person. The community is doing an amazing job maximizing revenues from the existing assets. That covers almost all the operating expenses of the community, which is absolutely remarkable. But what about special projects? How do you pay for the imported Jewish products? The answer for that is high membership, which I'll explain in a few minutes. Let me show you a couple of pictures to get a flavor of how Jewish life is today in Suriname. At the top right is Kabbalat Shabbat. Every Friday after the evening service, the community joined together in our small community hall for Kiddush and community dinner. The top left is Purim Spiel. The bottom right is the community Passover Seder. And the bottom left is Hanukkah. This is a picture that I took just before COVID in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And this is Simchat Torah. Now, what is the high membership? So 15 years ago, after 2 weeks working in Suriname, I was so touched by the warmth and friendship of the community. Understanding their challenges, I decided to do something to help. So I decided to start a high membership program, which is for $18, you can become a high member, and for $180, you become a lifetime member. That gives you all the privileges of any other member in the community. You can attend services, you can have bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah for your kids. If you want to get married, go do it. The only problem is if you want to come for a Friday night service, you have to fly to Suriname and it costs more than $1,000. But basically it is a one-time donation. And the objective was to support special projects that will help the community to continue to live meaningful Jewish life and thrive. We have today more than 120 members from all over the world. We publish Chai newsletter twice a year, which keep the members informed with many, many beautiful pictures. So let me share with you some of the projects that we funded in Chai member. It's only a few of them that, show you how small donation can help huge positive impact on such community. So we talked about Passover. Every year, I pay for the matzot and kosher wine to the supplier in Miami, since the community have no access to US dollars. The community pays for the shipment, which is the major cost, either by sea or by air, to Suriname. They pay it in Suriname dollars for local shipping companies. So it's a win-win. Without this arrangement, they would not have an access to matzot and wine, and there was no Passover Seders in Suriname. The next project that I wanted to mention is, for me, it was very, very personally important. It was the Holocaust Memorial Monument that we built. In 2015, I met with the community leadership. It was 70 years after the end of World War II. The president of the community, Shul Dong, said to me, Jacob, in the last 50 years, we were trying to build a memorial monument to the Surinamese Jews who died in the Holocaust. But it was too expensive, we couldn't afford it. So I asked him, Shul, you are in South America, the Holocaust was in Europe, what are you talking about? He said to me, in 1940, Suriname was a tiny country, less than 200,000 people. There was no university. If you wanted to study in university, you had to go to Holland. If you are a professional, such a doctor, and you wanted to specialize, you had to go to Holland. So did the business people, and many members had family members in Holland. So they go to visit and come back. Those people were in the wrong place, in the wrong time. He told me that over the years, the community identified about 85 members, names of members who died in the Holocaust. But he said to me, Jacob, there are many more. We just don't know who they are. They died with the entire family. He added that this is our last chance to make it. Would you help us? Now, how could I say no? So we met with the most famous architect in Suriname, who's a dear friend of the community. A week later, he presented us the proposal with an offer. He said it will be a turnkey operation because of all the complexities. For example, we had to import granite stones from China. We had to engrave it. We have to make the construction. We have no idea how to do that and who can do it. But he knows all the players in the industry. So he offered to do it at cost. And the cost was estimated at $15,000 US. So now we have two main challenges. One is the funding. Where do you get the money from? And the second one was, how do you come with a complete and accurate list of the names of the victims 70 years after the war was ended. So on the funding side, miracles do happen. 3 weeks after the meeting, 3 complete strangers to Suriname donated $10,000. They didn't even know where Suriname is on the map. The rest of the money was raised from our high members, and in 6 weeks, we were fully funded. What they couldn't do in 70 years, we did in 6 weeks. Now, identifying the names of the victims were a real challenge. We contacted Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and the Washington, D.C. Holocaust Museum. Nobody answered us, nobody came back to us. Time passed by week after week, and we felt that we are in dead end street. But again, miracles happen. From all places, I was working at a time in West Africa. I met by chance in Abidjan, the Ivory Coast, a young historian who works in Yad Vashem. When he heard my story, he promised to connect me with the right person upon his return to Jerusalem. So 2 weeks later, I received an email from Dr. Alex Avram. He is the director of the Wall of Names, which is the central database of the names of the Holocaust victims. He is the authority in the world for victim names of the Holocaust. In short, we compared list with Yad Vashem. They came with 20 names that we didn't have, and we had about 25 names that were not on the databases of Yad Vashem. So we agreed that now we have 104 names, and they are the most complete and accurate list possible. The name was passed to the architect to start to be engraved, and we started planning the ceremony. And in March 2016, the unveiling of the memorial monument for the 104 Surinamese Jews who died in the Holocaust took place on the grounds of the Neve Shalom synagogue in Paramaribo. The ceremony was attended by the ambassadors of all the countries who fought in World War II, all the religious leaders in Suriname, government officials, war veterans, and Holocaust survivors. It was a very touching ceremony indeed. Very briefly, I want to share with you the past merged the future. From the 650 tombstone that we had in the Jordan Savannah, in the Jewish Savannah, and Kasipora Crete, those are the cemeteries in the jungle, back from 1666 or 356 years ago, they all have beautiful engraved on them. The symbols can tell in many cases who the person was. For example, the person on the left was a Kohen. The person on the right was a Levi. One of the most common symbols is a tree being fallen by the angel of death or the hand of God. This symbol refers to the life that ended before its time or early death. Our architect decided to use the same symbol that their ancestors used for hundreds of years in our monument, as the victims, they say, all died before their time. As you can see at the top of in the right-hand side, the motif of the falling trees, it's going along the 4 sides of the monument. And that's how the monument looks on the other side. We have the name, family name, date of birth, date of death, and the camp that they were murdered. So 75 years after the end of World War II, the 104 Surinamese Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust are all now remembered. Previously, many were forgotten and some were erased from history altogether. So now every year in Yom HaShoah, the community gathers in front of the monument for a memorial ceremony. We read the names, we say the prayers, and we lay flowers in their memory. Now, 2 minutes, I'll go through some very fascinating projects that we did with the Chai members. This is our mikvah. It's 200 years old, one of the few in the world left with this kind of a structure, but it didn't work for more than 20 years because the pipes burst and they couldn't afford fixing it. We fixed it, today it's operational, it's gorgeous. We arranged a birthright trip to 16 youngsters of the community. And as you can see in the left side, the day, it was only by chance that they arrived to the Israel Museum, they opened the doors of the replica of the Tzedek V'Shalom synagogue. For them, it was very emotional because their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had the bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, and wedding in this synagogue. It was beautiful ceremony and beautiful visit. We have 3 cemeteries in Paramaribo, in the capital. Unfortunately, they were not fenced. So over the years, because they are close to downtown, they became the dumping ground of the city of Paramaribo. The place was horrific. Junkies were living there and everybody dumped their garbage in this place. It was unbearable. We decided enough is enough, something has to be done. So the community talked to the city of Paramaribo. From every cemetery, the Ashkenazi, the Sephardic, and the old Ashkenazi ones, they took more than 50 trucks full of dump and junk, but they cleaned everything. And we built the fence around it. You can see it's a metal fence, so nobody can come anymore inside, no junk and no dump. The place, if you drive today and you see the Jewish cemeteries in Paramaribo, are the most beautiful and were best respected and well taken care of in all the other ethnic communities in Paramaribo. And the last project that I'm talking about, it's something that we are in the middle now. We call it Every Grave Will Have a Name. Now, we identified 2.5 years ago about 600, more than 600 tombstones, graves without name. Those who had stones, some of them were destroyed or vandalized when there was no fence. Other, I cannot read anymore because of the stone is eroded over the years from the harsh tropical weather there. And the poor people that couldn't afford to have a stone, they used to have a post, wooden post with a marker. But over the years, they're disintegrated with the help of the termites and the harsh weather. So there are hundreds of graves with no name. And most of them are people that they have no family anymore in Suriname. So we decided that every grave will have a name. And the solution is very simple. Instead of a wooden post, we put a cement post, it will stay forever. And a small aluminum plaque would just say the name, family name, date of birth, and date of death. And that does it all. And we are in the middle of a process now to continue this project to make sure that all the tombstones are now identified and everyone has a name. And that's all thanks to the high membership that help us with small donations to make it happen. Now, before I finish, I just want to make last final comment. For those who don't know, the Jews in Suriname do not face any form of discrimination or anti-Semitism in Suriname. They are living in peace and harmony with all the neighbors and all the ethnic groups and all the religions in the country. This is an island of peace and stability. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. And if you have any questions, please, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Jacob. This is really, really fascinating and informative. I'm just going to stop your screen share so that we can see your face when you answer the questions. A bunch of people had some questions, so we'll get to as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
The first is, there are a few people here that have personal connections to Suriname through their family. Someone's mom fled Holland for Suriname, for example, in fact, on the boat that you showed in one of the pictures. And a few people asked if they could be in touch with you. So I'm wondering if you would feel comfortable sharing your email address to those who want to be in touch. And if you do, you could put that in the chat box.
I did if you go back to the presentation, I have one more chart with my email, so maybe I'll put it for a second, and people
sure.
can oops. Share the screen. Oh, here we go. Oops, sorry.
Great. Okay, perfect.
Can you see the
yes.
The slide? Okay, thank you.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So a few people asked about the Ashkenazi Jews and why they ended up coming, not the community that came during World War II or prior to World War II, but the ones who arrived earlier in the 1600s. Why did they end up, where did they leave, first of all, and why did they choose to come to Suriname as opposed to other places?
Yeah, they came mainly from Holland. Most of them came from Holland. There was Sephardic, the Portuguese Jewish community, and the Ashkenazi. The Ashkenazi started coming to Suriname after in 1621, 23, mainly from Germany and then from Lithuania and other places that they faced pogroms and stuff like that. So they moved to Holland because Holland had freedom of religion, one of the few countries. And they established the Ashkenazi Jewish community, but they were impoverished. The Sephardic took care of themselves. One helped other, and the people in Suriname that had money, the plantation owners, sent money to help the community. The Ashkenazi were very poor. So they heard that there is a Shangri-La in the north part of South America called Suriname. It's a Dutch colony. They could go there. And they thought maybe we will get our better luck for our families. And they started moving to Paramaribo. But as I said, they were not allowed to own land there because the special privileges allowed only to Sephardic Jews to own land. And they became petty traders and merchants in Paramaribo and started their own community.
Okay, great, thank you. A couple people have asked whether there is a Chabad in Suriname, and if not, why not?
No, there's no Chabad for a couple of reasons. Chabad coming on an annual basis, but they basically do head count of how many Jews left and stuff like that. They are not there for a few reasons. First of all, there are hardly no tourism to Suriname. It's untouched place, you know, fantastic place, like the last Eden, as the Australian called it in the newspaper, but there are no visitors, very few from Holland, and that's it. So Chabad is coming, there's no tourism, so there's no income for them. And we are now a progressive or, you know, not Orthodox community. Although there are things that's hard to change. The men are sitting in one side, we closed it as Ezrat Nashim, so they will join together, but the women sit in one side, the men sit in the other side, still not mixing. But we will not go back to Orthodox way of life, and Chabad have nothing to do to support themselves. And to make short, that's the main reason. But the other reason is, for me, I was very disappointed with Chabad. I'll tell you a short story. There was, in Guyana, the next country on the west, there's no Jewish community, but there was an old lady, one family of Jews lived there, the other family. And she passed away, and there's no Jewish cemetery, and they wanted to bury her. So they contact Chabad. Chabad say, oh, well, in Venezuela at the time. It's a big Chabad organization there. And they said, sorry, we don't have the money. We cannot help you, but what we will do, we will make sure that 500 rabbis all over the world will make Kaddish for her. And the Suriname Jewish community said, we don't need rabbis to say Kaddish, we need to bury her first. And what we did, we're very not rich community, but we raised money immediately. The board met, raised money, and flew the body from Guyana to Suriname and buried her. And I visited 2 years ago her tombstone, and beautifully. But for me, it left a very bad taste on the attitude, you know. When you have a mitzvah to do and you said, come with excuses and just say Kaddish, thank you so much. So there's no Chabad, and most probably there will not be Chabad for the time to come.
Okay, thank you. Going back a little bit, during the 18th century, did Jews hold political or administrative offices?
No, the Jews have their autonomy. There was like independent state within the state. It's called the Portuguese Jewish nation. As you saw in the sign, it was the Jewish nation. They were not ruled by the Dutch. They have their own rules. The community was divided to two authorities. The religious authority, the Jews were Orthodox, all the same like the Christians. At that time in the 17th and 19th century, everybody in Europe was very religious, and so were the Jews. So the religious authority was the rabbinical authority, and they controlled the religious life of the people. The board of directors, or the Parnasim, they were taking care of the rules of the Jewish nation, which was how we're going to live, not on the religious side, but the day-to-day rules and regulations of the Jewish community. So they were completely independent from the Dutch. You know, they are not lived under the rules. And one of the things that the Dutch were constantly, the governor generals from Holland were always in argument with the Jewish community because the Jews allowed their slaves freedom on Shabbat because they were allowed to, you know, they had to under the supervision of the rabbinical authorities and they followed the halakha. But the rest of the Christian plantation owners, they worked 7 days a week and never freed them. So there was a complete, constantly for more than 100 years, constant tension between the Dutch crown representative, the ruler of Suriname by the Dutch, and the Jews authorities.
Okay, thank you. A question about the current Jewish community. Without a permanent rabbi, how is the community structured? And is there a Hebrew school, for example, a place for children to learn year round?
Very good question. I just want to mention that since I started the Chai program, we had 2 rabbis came as volunteers for 2-3 months to help the community, you know, to give some spiritual leadership. Rabbi Chaim Beliak spent 3 months, and another rabbi came for another period of 2 months. But most of the time, we don't have a rabbi. Rabbi Mennoten Brink from Amsterdam is supposed to be the spiritual leader, but he's in Amsterdam and we are in Suriname. The community has board of directors, president and board of directors. The board of directors are elected on an annual basis and they are representing the members and they do the rules and regulations for the community. For education, once every couple of years, we have a burst of Jewish education, kind of. So we have a couple of members, Lily, the vice president of the community, she was running Hebrew classes when there was quite nice group of young children. But now they're already young adults. And the young generation, they do get some education. And, you know, we read the Torah in Hebrew. So there is continuity, but it is not on an ongoing basis of Jewish education because now we had the COVID-19, it ruined everything. People couldn't come to the synagogue. There was no transportation in Paramaribo because of the, you know, the public transportation was not running, etc., etc. But there is on and off Jewish education programs that ran by people in the community, or when the rabbi is coming for short term, they run also Jewish education programs. It's hard, it's not easy, but we do our best.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question, actually kind of 2 questions on the same topic, if I'm not mistaken, and then we will say thank you and close up. Did the agreement in 1947 require the approval of the Dutch government? And then the second question is, if the state of Israel had never been established, would the Saramaka project have been suspended anyway?
I think the Saramaka plan was approved by the local authorities, the local Surinamese government. The Dutch couldn't force them to stop it, but they had the key to the safe. They were dependent on the money which came from Holland at that time. So the colonial power had very strong influence on the local government. The local government supported the Dutch crown, didn't support it. They're very not friendly to the Jews for many, many years. Having said it, it went through, but when the state of Israel was declared, the Dutch government used their leverage on the local government of Suriname and forced them to abandon the plan. So in my opinion, if there was no state of Israel, the Saramaka plan was going on. It was no way that the Dutch could stop it if they want or if they don't want. It was just like refugees during World War II. The governor general did everything in his power to stop Jews coming. But the locals accepted them, the local parliament accepted them, so they came and they stayed.